Hey Beachsiders, good to be with you and anybody else who's watching. This is the third video in a series on Christianity and culture. And so today I want to get into something that came into my mind with yesterday's sermon by Pastor Chris. Good to have him back. And that was a thing that came into my mind about a book I read a couple years back called Ideas Have Consequences. It was written in the 1940s, and R.C. Sproul actually wrote another book kind of in response to that book because it was a very influential book. And you can just tell by the title what the book is about. Ideas have consequences. And when we look at this culture, what do we see as the foundational idea for why this culture is on fire, why we see what we're seeing? And I believe that idea is very simple but very profound, and it is there is no God. Okay? When you think about that idea, the consequences of that idea are far and reaching. Okay? So if there is no God, there are many consequences, which we'll get into in the video in a minute. But I kind of want to go backwards for a minute to our foundation of this country. You've probably heard the statement that this country has been founded on Christian principles, and in the last 20, 30 years, that has been attacked heavily. And I want to talk about that for a second because I do believe we are based on Christian principles. But what the crowd that's against that is saying is many of the people who founded this country were not Christians. They did not believe in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And when you actually look into it, many of them were theists. They believed, or deists, they believed that there was a higher power, and not necessarily the Christian higher power. But let's think about that for a minute. If there's a higher power and it decides good and evil, there's some good things that can come out of that. And so Thomas Jefferson is a name that comes to mind that was probably more of a deist or a theist than he was a Christ follower. But he believed in the principles of thou shalt not murder, that there is a higher power deciding right and wrong. And when you base your country on that, Thomas Jefferson would have very much so used many of the biblical principles in his understanding of our country. And so I do agree with the statement that our country is founded on Christian principles. And I also agree with the statement that there was a good portion of our founding fathers who were not Christ followers, but they believed in the idea that there was a God. And today you have an opposite idea that there is no God, and that is a big difference. And so you look at the consequences of that idea. I want to go to a quote by um, Ralph Waldo Emerson, a non-believer, a poet, and this is something that he said. So even truth out of the mouths of unbelievers. A person will worship something. Have no doubt about it. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will come out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and our character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship. For what we are worshiping, we are becoming. And that's by Ralph Waldo Emerson, a very timely quote in this day and age. Because if there is no God, well, guess what? Humans are built to worship. And so if we are not worshiping God, we are worshiping something. And you look at this culture, our culture's on fire. There's this foundational idea that there is no God. And when there is no God, guess what? Something takes the place of worship. And so what Pastor Chris talked about was love, war, and money yesterday in the sermon, which I totally agree with. And I want to bring up the idea of humanism, okay? So humanism is the central importance of man over the divine. There is no divine in humanism, or the humans are just much, much more important than the divine. So if there is no God, then you look further into it, humans start worshiping themselves. They start to lift up the importance of man, so much so that one COVID death, for example, is a utter tragedy. It is utter destruction. It is depressing because humankind is the center of the universe. And if we are at the center of the universe, death is not understandable. Okay, death is not explainable. Death is not a purposeful thing, and so when we look at the overreaction, I would say, to the deaths that are occurring, and when I say overreaction, don't misunderstand me that that these deaths are not tragic. Okay, I do believe they are tragic, but when I say overreaction, I mean we are afraid to function in life. We are afraid to live our lives in the face of a scary unknown, but there's much more known about it now. But you can't say that we can't function in life due to a few 1,000 deaths every week. And honestly, if we look at the statistics, and again, I'm probably going to be accused of being unloving towards this situation. And you can accuse me of that, and that's fine. But statistically speaking, more car accident deaths this year, more deaths this year from dysentery around the world than from COVID. So dysentery, look that up if you don't know what that means. But worldwide, COVID is actually a very small percentage of deaths in this world. But because it's unknown, because it's something that we don't understand, because it's not part of the plan, as the Joker says in the second Batman movie, because it's not part of the plan, people freak out. And again, a lack of foundation, a lack of understanding of who people are, what their purpose is, what their destiny is. When you say there is no God, this life is all there is. This life is all people have to live for. And so we have quite the opportunity to tell people what their purpose is, to tell people what life is about, to tell people what death is about. Death is just the beginning. Okay. But for a person or a group of people that we see now that say there is no God, it is quite a scary and unexplainable ending to life. And so we will all worship something, and idolatry is a big issue that's occurring now in this culture. And so to finish up this thinking, I want to think about Sodom and Gomorrah for a minute. Sodom and Gomorrah was a city of Sodom was a city of 600 to 1,200 people. And if you remember the story with Abraham, Abraham asked God to save the city for 50 righteous people. Okay, 50 righteous people. And he gets the number down to 10. 10 out of 600. Do you realize 10 out of 600 is about 1.6%? For 1.6% of righteous people, God was willing to spare Sodom. God was willing to spare Sodom and Gomorrah. Amazing to me that such a low percentage of righteousness goes a long way. And you actually look at the New Testament, you look at Matthew 5, and it says, we are the salt of the earth. We are the preservatives of the earth. We preserve the culture around us even when the culture is on fire. And so it really starts with the church. And that's the one thing I want you to take away from this video, even if you might disagree with portions of it or think I'm acting in a way that's not loving. I want you to hear this, okay? I do love all people who don't know Christ, and I want them all to know Jesus. And if they should die of COVID or dysentery or anything, we want them to know about Christ and to live lives that reflect that. But God is willing to spare a culture for a small amount of righteousness. So it starts and ends with the church. If the church is living righteously, living for God's plan, living in righteousness, doing what's right, not doing what's wrong, doing the commandments that God has given to us, to go and make disciples, to evangelize, to meet together regularly. It starts and ends with the church. And that's something that's kind of lost. I think, right now the big idea is it starts and ends in politics. And again, we have to move our thinking from politics to the church. The church is the center of God's plan. The church is the center of God's plan. And if we can just realize that and let that impact our minds and choose to do what's right, to choose to be the church that the Bible talks about, especially in the book of Acts, that's reaching thousands of people, that is meeting together regularly, that is seeing God move. Not only can this culture be redeemed, but people in it can be redeemed, and we can see a revival of sorts. I don't know how big, I don't know how grand, if the church acts like the church. Okay, so right now we are fighting against humanism, the idea that we are at the center of the universe, and that idea comes from there is no God. So we have to change people's minds. And when I say we have to present the gospel and allow God to do the work that He has prepared beforehand for us to do, and that we can join Him with Him. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and we'll continue talking about culture and Christianity in future videos.